Mysterious creatures in North Carolina, bizarre hunting encounters, and something strange in your back garden. Today's stories are both terrifying and interesting. Better grab a 5-hour energy or two because you're about to stay awake all night after these tales. Enjoy this episode, and remember, if you want to share your story with us, send it to us at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. A hunting story. I'm an avid hunter and have been for most of my adult life. A little backstory before this happened. I'm a marksman and I was a rifleman in the army. I've been hunting on and off since I was 15 years old, and I've been hunting consistently now for the last 5 years. So I'm no stranger to the woods of West Tennessee and the sounds that are supposed to be normal. I had taken my children's 410 single-shot shotgun out to do some squirrel hunting, since it is a nice snack for me and the kids. It was about 30 minutes before the twilight part of dusk when I departed to the woods behind the house. I'd been out for about 5 minutes when I saw a squirrel jumping from tree to tree. I decided to follow it as I slowly eased the hammer back on the shotgun, shouldering it and taking aim. I fired just below the squirrel, because with me being 29 and using a youth model shotgun, I had to compensate for the difference in build that the gun is rated for. After I fired, I looked around the tree before making my way through the swamp area where it was at. The swamp is only ankle deep here, so no real worries, just annoying walking through leaf-filled water because you can't see the holes that may be there. I made my way toward the tree. Now, past the swamp is a small creek that is a little more than ankle deep but can be knee deep in some places. As I crossed into that creek, things got weird. I walked over to the tree and saw that there was no squirrel around it. Not uncommon since this gun is made for a 10-year-old, and I'm 30. As I start to wander around to see if maybe the squirrel was alive and crawling around, I heard my daughter screaming. She yells loud enough to hear a mile away, but the kids and my wife are at the play area, over 200 yards from where I'm at. So, no surprise that I heard her. What bothered me, though, was I began hearing a humming sound, followed by footsteps coming from all around me. I'm pulling 360s looking around as I draw my Taurus Judge from my pocket, loading it with 410 shells. I then hear what sounded like my youngest son, yelling, "Yay," like he does when he sees me. I lower the gun, thinking that maybe they're going to meet me at the edge of the woods. As I cross the creek heading back, I only hear the humming noise. I call my wife on the phone, and when she answers, my first question is, "Hey, where are you guys at?" She replied, "We're at the play area. Why?" My blood instantly runs cold as I bring my gun up again. Did you guys ever come close to where I'm hunting?" I asked. "We've been up here this whole time. Why? Are you okay?" I then explained to her the noises I've been hearing, what's been going on over the last few minutes, and now she's worried about me. "What are you going to do?" she asks. "I'm going to start heading your way, okay?" I let her know as I walk through the swamp and back toward the trail, between my ponds and toward my backyard. The humming noise has stopped ever since I left the swamp though, but as I walked toward my family, I hear and I see my son humming. The hum is identical to what I heard in the woods, but I know it wasn't him. It couldn't have been him that I was hearing in the woods. He's a very quiet child, and we were way too far apart to hear him out there. Better yet, the sound of him humming now, as I watched him, was more quiet than the sound of humming that I heard out there, as if the sound in the woods was closer. I'm a firm believer in the paranormal and supernatural, and I wholeheartedly feel and fear that something was trying to trick me or lure me. If so, I'm afraid that I'm in danger, and perhaps my family. Maybe we entered its territory without knowing, and it doesn't want us here. The Beast of North Carolina. I'm from North Carolina, but have lived in Florida for a good chunk of my life. Every now and then, my family and I head back up to our house in the mountains to check on the place and enjoy the scenery and whatnot. I do love going up there, visiting my old home, but after what happened last time, I think I'll stay down in the Sunshine State for a while, as what I'm about to tell you may keep me from ever going back to that house again. This happened when I was 16, back in December of 2018, roughly a year ago. My family and I were heading up to the house in North Carolina for a family reunion the first week after Christmas. I was hesitant about going at first, but it had been a couple of years since I last went home. Not to mention the opportunity to take off a whole week of work sealed the deal for me. We left on a rainy Monday mid-morning. The 10-hour drive was pitiful given the rain, and my dad spun out a few times and his temper was through the roof. Once we got to the house, it was around 7 p.m. and was already dark. When we got all of our stuff inside and unpacked, we had turned on the water, cable, and all that jazz. My grandparents arrived shortly after, and we helped them unpack their stuff as well. My mom started cooking us dinner while my sister Jane and I were walking towards the door to go take a brief walk in the woods behind the house outside. But that's when my grandpa took hold of us and stopped us. "Where do you two think you're going?" he said.
"Just going on a walk in the woods a little bit till dinner's ready,"
I replied. He gave me a strange look.
"I wouldn't do that if I were you. Those woods can be dangerous at night."
"What do you mean?"
Jane asked him. He went on about how there were wild animals out there that could hurt us, and roots in the ground that we could trip over. Just basically everything he could think of to keep us from going out there that night. Odd. Jane and I listened to him and agreed not to go outside. We didn't want to make him mad. Dinner was ready soon after, and we all ate some chili my mother had cooked up for us. Then we went to bed early. That night, given the long day and drive we'd had, everyone was pretty tired. I stayed in the room upstairs that I used to when I was a kid. Not too big and not too small, and it had 2 windows on the wall in the back of the room. Now, this next part is a little embarrassing, but I was listening to some music with an AirPod in one ear while getting ready for bed when I remembered that I'd brought my THC vape pen with me. I was going through some things at the time and I used it as a stress reliever, but still I never should have turned to that. Anyway, I was about to take a hit from it when I heard something outside the window. The woods are behind our house, so that's what I was facing once I looked out the window. I noticed that the outside house lights were on, so someone forgot to turn them off before bed. As I was glancing outside, I saw a figure peeking behind one of the trees right outside the woods, and they seemed to be peering in at me. I turned off the light in my room to get a better look at it, and I really wish I hadn't. What I was looking at was an insanely large figure. I know I was on the 2nd story of the house, but my God, this being had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. I got a look at its face, and it looked like the face of a German Shepherd. I thought, why in the world would a dog be standing on its hind legs, peeking behind a tree like that? And how was it so far off the ground? I got a better look, I could see razor-sharp teeth in its maw, and it honestly looked like this thing was smiling. But you know how dogs do, their smiles actually being a sign of aggression or anger. Those eyes, though, those dark red, soul-piercing eyes, they were something that I can't forget. Its arm was wrapped around the tree. After I noticed that arm, I noticed that it didn't have paws or anything like the sort. Instead, it had hands like a man, and its arm was big and strong like a bodybuilder. I was horrified, to say the least. The only thing I could compare it to was some sort of werewolf straight from a horror film. As it continued to grin at me, I then watched it wave. I froze. I couldn't move a muscle even if I wanted to. I think this creature knew that and was enjoying every second of my torment. I heard my sister call my name from the hallway then. I could move again, so I quickly put away my vape pen and I went to see what she wanted, still trembling. When she saw me, my sister asked what was wrong. She could tell something was off. I rolled my shoulders and said I just was watching some horror movies, because obviously she wouldn't have believed me if I told her what I saw outside. After she went back to bed, I shut all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, making darn sure that thing could not get in if it tried. Although I'm sure nothing would have stopped it. I did take one last glance outside before locking up, and that creature was gone. I tried to take my mind off of it, but I couldn't. As I tried to sleep, the night grew late, and instead of a good rest, I received something else. In the middle of the night, I heard a deep and gut-wrenching howl from the woods, which made sure that I would not be sleeping that night. I never told anyone about this, as no one would believe me. I avoided those woods the rest of the trip, and never felt happier to leave. What I saw that night will haunt me for the rest of my days, but I am simply glad it didn't try to break into the house, because I know for a fact it would not have ended well for anyone. If you live in the west side of North Carolina, be careful, because there's something in the woods, and it watches you through your window. Dweller in the Forest. This happened in 2015. I was 19 years old. I'm from Scotland and was studying forestry at the time. The course took me to many a wooded area and forest. I was in a dense pine and spruce forest, which had been planted for timber production in the heart of Dumfries and Galloway. It was mid-October and around 3 p.m. when I entered through the tree line. As high as the sun was at the time, little light managed to reach through the forest floor, which was littered with branches and needles. Hardly any vegetation grew on the actual ground. There was really only sporadic patches of moss. It was gradually getting darker as I continued to make my way into the woods. I decided at one point to find a spot to sit down in a patch of light, to have a drink of water and a snack. Around 25 minutes had passed until I finally found a good small clearing. It was about 4 meters in diameter with a high stump near the center of it. There were also a few bushy pine saplings growing opposite of the stump, on the edge of the clearing. With a deep breath, I sat down and I began to relax, taking a bottle of water and a sandwich from my rucksack. I was sitting there for maybe 5 minutes, taking my time to eat and drink. I was admiring the sun shining down on me and the sound of the wind blowing through the trees. But there was an interruption. I heard a loud thumping on the forest floor, like someone was throwing very large rocks as hard as they could onto the ground. The sound would happen every 4 or 5 seconds, and seemed to be only about 15 meters outside of the clearing. They were getting closer, though, with each thump. I thought it must have been a massive stag, clomping to the ground, but it didn't sound like the methodical footfalls of a deer, or any animal that I knew for that matter. Then I heard another distinct noise, like a very large and very heavy object being dragged along the ground. I stopped eating to listen more carefully, internally wondering just what sort of animal decided to come join me. At this point, I was honestly more curious than afraid. It soon made its way to the edge of the clearing and was rustling its way through the saplings. Then it emerged, first its arm and then the entire front half of its grotesque body came into my view. I sat there frozen on the stump. I was like a terrified statue, not moving, just barely breathing, staring wide-eyed at this obscene creature. I took it all in at once. It had an overall vaguely human shape. Its skin was a ragged and mottled pale yellow, like milk left to curdle out in the sun for days. Small patches of darker skin, gray or off-white, were on its neck. Every single bone looked to be thin, stretched and brittle underneath skin, yet the joints of its fingers, elbows, and wrists were swollen, almost comically large, and seemed to be weighing the thing down, as if every movement was a struggle to lift its limbs. Its hideous face was seared into my mind when I got it all in. The eyes were large and bulbous like that of an insect, protruding outward, covering the top half of its head, which was the same sort of shade as the mottled patches of skin. They had no iris or pupil that I could see. It seemed to be filled with an unmoving liquid, almost like the entire eye was a cataract and bulged slightly outward. A putrid-looking deep and vertical wound or orifice was on the lower half of its face. Strips of its bloody flesh swayed as it moved, and a slimy, blunted tongue hung limp and foul, about 30 centimeters in length from in between the torn skin directly beneath the eyes. Ragged exhales and hoarse, gargling inhales was all I could hear during this. No birds, no wind, or anything of the like. Its head was wider and more stout-looking than a human's, connected to a pair of narrow shoulders by seemingly no neck. The rest of its body was mundane compared to the head and face. It was elongated and emaciated. Abnormally long fingers and toes, but the limbs were in moderate proportion to a man of over 6 feet. Yet even still, they were bent and twisted in a manner that would rip muscles and tendons in a normal person. The way the creature moved was more of a twitch, like some sort of offbeat staccato rhythm or a lizard moving in increments. It did not look at me directly, though it was facing in my direction. Altogether, half a minute had passed by then. It appeared to be cautious while I sat on that stump for what seemed like an eternity, petrified. Eventually, however, the creature turned around, bones creaking and pained, its mouth emanating a rattling moan in a raspy tone. The noise reverberated in the silent woods and lasted nearly an entire minute. During the encounter, I'd made my peace with it. I honestly believed that my life would be at an end here, that I was at the mercy of this being, and that no one would ever find me. Grabbing my bag, I shot up and dashed back into the woods, in the opposite direction of where I saw it. The sun had not completely gone down yet, so I made my way well enough. I didn't stumble or lose my footing, but I was pretty much without sense of where I was. No identifying landmarks besides that clearing. Thankfully, after a few minutes of panicked jogging, I found a dirt road used by forestry vehicles, which had a clear pale gray sky at one end. I bolted towards it, and I wasn't that far away from the exit, thankfully. I followed the track out of the forest and eventually connected to a main road. Finally knowing where I was, not far from the public entrance where I left my car, 10 minutes later, and I was inside my little hatchback, radio blasting, high beams on, and doors locked shut. I was shaking still, taking deep breaths. I calmed down well enough once I was distracted and headed back into town. I went straight to the bed and breakfast where I was staying. I packed up and left within the hour, though. I've been to countless other forests since then, and have never experienced a single thing close to that. Nothing close to being paranormal or unnatural. I've asked friends, family, and coworkers if they've seen anything unusual in the woods, but they just either mention ghosts, drug-related activity, or dead animals. This doesn't bother me as much since the years have gone by, but I'm always apprehensive about going into any woodland alone and in the dark. Someone keeps breaking into my back garden at night. Someone, or perhaps even something, keeps breaking into my back garden at night. I only noticed it about a week ago. It was late one afternoon, and I'd gone into the garden to fetch a storage box I'd left in my dad's tool shed. For reference, my garden is quite long and narrow, with a tall wooden fence providing some level of privacy from our neighbors on either side. My dad had built a small tool shed that sat at the end of the garden, and behind the shed a tall metal gate opened out onto a back alley that ran along the back of the houses on my street. As I grabbed the box and shut the shed door, starting to make my way back to the house, I suddenly heard a creaking noise coming from behind the shed. I paused and strained my ears to listen. The noise was much louder this time, and I almost dropped the box in fright. What in the world was that? I thought. I placed the box on the floor and proceeded to head around the back of the shed. To my confusion, the padlock that usually kept the gate shut was now lying on the ground, broken into two separate pieces. And that creaking sound turned out to be the now open gate, swaying in the late afternoon breeze. We always kept the gate locked to stop anyone from trying to get into our garden from the alley. Yet there the heavy-duty padlock was, had been cut through, and now laid discarded on the ground. My immediate thought was that a burglar had gained access to our garden. When they might have gotten in, I can't be sure, but the thought that someone had been so determined to get inside that they broke the padlock freaked me out. I immediately headed back inside the shed, pulled out a couple of extra padlocks we kept inside, and I proceeded to shut the gate, and this time, I double padlocked the gate for safety. Satisfied that the gate was now once again secure, I locked up the shed and headed back inside. I told my family that someone had broken the lock on the gate. My family members, though worried at the thought of someone coming into the garden, told me not to worry about it too much, that we should just keep an eye on things for now. That night, I couldn't sleep though. It's hard to explain, but the moment I entered my bedroom to go to bed, I was overtaken by this intense sense of dread. The whole incident with the gate was scarier for me, but I felt it wasn't enough to warrant this intense sense of fear that I felt. I mean, my dad and older brother, who I lived with, were two big hulking men, and more than intimidating enough to scare off any would-be intruder. But seeing as my room sat at the back of the house, overlooking the garden, it was hard not to think about someone trying to sneak in again. Eventually, I started to drift off, but suddenly, I was immediately brought back to full consciousness by the sound of a loud clanging reverberating through the garden. I should point out that the reason I heard this so clearly is because I always slept with my window slightly ajar. I always did this no matter what, as my room was always stuffy during the night. I sat straight up in bed, and I continued to listen. I heard the sound of metal creaking, followed by the sounds of heavy footfalls coming down the paved path that ran down the length of the garden. My heart began to race. Then, the speed of the footsteps increased as if the person was running full sprint toward the house, and then I heard a loud bang against the back door. I screamed and immediately bolted out of the room down the stairs, dialing 999, our version of 911, as I did so. I frantically checked to make sure both the front and the back door were locked, while my frenzied dash about the house woke up my dad and brother. The police were called, and by the time that I explained to my family that I had heard the back gate open and the sounds of footsteps, followed by the loud bang on the back door, the two officers searched the garden and alley for an intruder. But their search turned up nothing. Despite me distinctly hearing the gate to the alley creak open again, the officers found that the gate was still locked up tight, with both padlocks in place. There was no sign of anyone breaking into the garden, and I got a sense from the officers that they did not believe my story. But to their credit, they did agree to patrol the area and keep watch outside the house for a while, just in case anything else happened. But of course, the rest of the night was uneventful. The two officers stopped by the next morning, confirming that there had been no other signs of an intruder lurking about. They told us to let them know if anything further happened, and they left. But every night since then, I've heard those same footsteps. The second night it happened, I called my brother into my room and asked him to listen. The footsteps went on, but my brother said he heard nothing. Now my brother looks at me like I'm crazy. The third night I heard it, I asked my dad to search the garden, but he found nothing. And now even my dad looks at me with the most pitying looks. He thinks I didn't hear his phone call with the doctor about me hearing things, but I did. It's been a week since the first incident, and I swear every night the footsteps get louder. Yet, I'm the only one that hears them. I'm scared. Maybe I really am going crazy. But what if I'm experiencing something real? I just hope that my boarded up window and barricaded bedroom door are enough to keep out whatever or whoever it is. Encounter in the woods. My little sister Maddie and I would go in the woods and make forts and stuff all the time. We would spend hours playing out there. One day we took my little cousin up there as well. He wanted to see what it was like. It was raining that day. We were on our way up and my little sister looked a bit scared. The rain was coming down a bit hard and the sky was overcast. But I didn't mind. My little cousin was acting normally, so my little sister calmed down, and we began to work on my big fort that I'd started on previously. We were trying to make a little fort village. A couple of hours later, we went for a walk to find some sticks to make walls, but then we found something else, a very eerie-looking cave. Just looking towards it made me shiver. I think it scared all of us in some way. But then the little ones got too scared and ran back to the house, leaving me standing in front of the cave alone. And it was starting to get dark out. There was something wrong about this cave. I couldn't really put my finger on it. But one thing's for sure. I could not stop staring into the opening, into the dark void that filled the inside. And I did not stop staring, even as something alive and pale began to crawl out of it. This creature was about 6 feet long, without a tuft of hair on its body. It had black claws and eyes that matched. They were moist little black marbles with no life inside them. I felt as if I was going to pass out. The smell that accompanied the creature was awful. It was like a rotting body, yet this creature was very much alive. Then I did something without thinking. I ran for my life. I ended up tripping on a tree root in my hurry, and I fell down the hill, cutting my leg open on a sharp stick. My adrenaline was pumping, so I didn't even bother paying attention to it. I just kept running. I could hear something crawling frantically behind me, but I made it out of the woods alive. I looked back when I thought I was safe, and I could see it from the tree line, going back into its little dark cave. I found my sister and cousin crying in my sister's room. Our parents weren't home at the time. They asked me why I was bleeding. I had to do it. I had to lie to them and tell them that I was fine, and that I'd simply slipped on the driveway. I cleaned up my wound and acted like nothing happened, but now I'm too scared to go back in the woods at all. That's the end of my little story. Just keep one thing in mind. If you're ever out in the woods of British Columbia, Canada, and you happen upon some half-built stick forts, you might soon see something pale and crawling on 4 legs. Well, how'd you like today's stories? What if I told you one of them was a creepypasta? Which one would you guess? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you want to share your story with us, send it to us at darkstories.org. If you'd like to support the show, check out the links below. There's a link to my Patreon where you can donate and keep us afloat, and a link to my merch store to get some creepy shirts. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite comments from the previous episode, titled, "Something is Killing People in Cairngorms National Park, and if you talk about it, you'll be arrested." Tish in LMS says, "Hells to the yesa. Had me thinking I better not leave this comment or they'll know I know and disappear me. Well, now I'm reading it, and now they'll know I know you know that they know. Good luck." Hastia Art says, "Great timing. I'm drawing a murderous character right now." Well, if you tweet me on Twitter, I'd love to see what you drew. Just at me with @DarkPrevails. Jamie Trite says, "WTF, the SCP Foundation, they're here." This story definitely did sound like an SCP story, but have you ever wondered if the real world has its own SCPs? And Just Some Bigfoot with internet access says, "That's why we Bigfoots never go to Cairngorms National Park." Oh, don't you lie. I know it was just a shaved and especially feverish one of you trying to prank people. And Jared Slater says, "The first 5 seconds reminds me of checking your phone after blacking out at a party the night before." Who knows, Jared, maybe that's what happened to me, but I damned well wasn't at a party. You gotta have friends for those. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode, but don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're great people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.